In today's video, we're going to make these cute little gingerbread ornaments and pillow. Gingerbread decor is timeless and can be used throughout your home to add a little whimsical charm. You can dress them up with embellishments or give them a simple but classic look. If you're new to my channel, thanks for stopping by. I hope you'll hit the subscribe button and notification bell so you don't miss out on future videos. And if you enjoyed this tutorial, please give it a thumbs up to support my channel. You'll only need a few supplies that you may already have on hand, including felt or other material, buttons, ribbon, and some crochet thread or embroidery floss. Distressing ink is optional, and I'll show you examples with and without it. Now let's have some fun creating these cute little gingerbread. To make a gingerbread template, you can either draw it by hand or find a template online. If you Google gingerbread shape or gingerbread template, you'll find a bunch of different options and different sizes. I transferred the design to some freezer paper. This works great instead of using pins to secure the template onto the fabric. Using a medium heat, I go over the paper and felt a few times until it's secure. This makes it so much easier to cut the template out without having to deal with any stick pins. Just make sure that you put the waxy or shiny side down. That's what sticks to the fabric, and it doesn't damage the fabric when you peel it off. And the freezer paper can be reused several times. After cutting the entire shape, you can simply peel the paper off. You'll cut two of these templates for the front and back of the gingerbread. I'll be using some distressing ink for this project. It gives the cookie some dimension and makes it look lightly browned from the oven. I bought this felt from Hobby Lobby in the color sandstone. They sell it in individual squares as well as by the yard. Buying it by the yard is definitely more of a value, and you can make several objects from it. I'm using a makeup sponge that I got from the Dollar Tree to apply it. They also have dauber tools that you can use so that your fingers don't get full of ink. If you don't have any of the daubers and use a makeup sponge like I am, I would suggest using some latex gloves so that it doesn't get all over your hands. If you're using the distressing ink, don't forget to do the back side of the gingerbread. I'm going to start adding some embellishments. I used 2 strands of red embroidery floss to sew some buttons onto the front. You could also use Fabri-Tac or hot glue if you don't want to sew, but the sewing does add some nice detail to the gingerbread. I sewed the classic cross pattern over the button. In my opinion, the stitching is what really makes these gingerbread ornaments stand out, so I'm going to add a little extra detail to the buttons. To finish the button, I'll add a French knot to each side of the button. If you're using 2 strands of embroidery floss like I did, I wrapped it around the needle 4 times. If you're using a thicker thread, you only need to go around the needle 2 or 3 times. I purchased a square of red and white checkered fabric from the Dollar Tree, and I'm just going to make a simple finger bow to add to the gingerbread. Full disclosure, I'm not a bow maker. I hate making them. I'm not good at it, but I just kind of muddled through this finger bow to get it to the shape and size that I wanted. I used Fabri-Tac to attach the bow to the gingerbread. I trimmed the ribbon to the size that I wanted and frayed the edges a bit to give it a more rustic look. I glued on some beads for the eyes. To increase the cuteness factor, I just added some blush to the cheeks. I used chalk pastels, but you can also use eyeshadow or blush. Just apply it really gently by tapping it in. You don't want to brush it across the felt because that will loosen the fibers. I added a tiny jingle bell to the center of the bow just to give it a little more detail. I wanted to use red rickrack for this project, but I only had pink and white, so I painted the rickrack to the color that I wanted. I pounced the color in just to make sure it gets into all the little grooves of the ribbon. To blend the ribbon in and make the project cohesive, I decided to add some distressing ink to the ribbon. I started sewing around the edge of the gingerbread, and I highly recommend adding the rickrack after you've sewn the edge. Otherwise, you may have to stitch into the rickrack, and if you've painted yours like mine, it's really hard to get that needle through and it just doesn't look right. I used the blanket stitch around the outside of the project To me, the blanket stitch is perfect for this project and it really makes it stand out. I don't show you the blanket stitch for this ornament because it's a smaller project and I really wanted you to see, if you don't know how to do the blanket stitch, how it's done. So I do show you that in more detail in the next project. I already glued the rickrack to the areas where I haven't sewn yet, but trust me, you'll want to do the sewing first. If you want to use the gingerbread as a tree ornament, you can glue a hanger at the top before sewing around it. I used some red and white baker's twine that I got from the Dollar Tree. Here's a look at the gingerbread when I've sewn almost completely around and it's ready for stuffing. I made the mistake of not leaving myself a big enough hole before I added the stuffing, so you definitely don't want to do that. But again, I'll show you in more detail in the next project. Here's a look at the final gingerbreads. I think they turned out super cute. You don't have to use them as an ornament. You can just place them around the house and they would look spectacular in a tiered tray. After making this cute little crochet gingerbread pillow, I was inspired to do another one using felt. Just like before, I Googled gingerbread shape or gingerbread template, and you'll get a bunch of options. And then I took it to my printer and just enlarged it to the size that I wanted. The Dollar Tree does sell a large gingerbread cutout from felt that you can use, and it's the right size to make a pillow. I cut the template from the same felt that I used for the previous project. I wanted to use buttons for embellishment, but I didn't have two in the size and color that I wanted, so I took two pink buttons and painted them red. To make it easier to paint small or round objects, just place the item on some tape to hold it still. I'll be using crochet thread for this project, so it is thicker than the embroidery floss and it's easier to see for demonstrating. Now, after making a number of these gingerbread ornaments, I think it is much easier if you start on a straight edge. The blanket stitch can be worked in a couple of different ways. You can go from front to back or back to front. For this demonstration, I'll be going front to back. The stitch placement is super important when dealing with the blanket stitch. You want your stitches to be evenly spaced and all of a similar size. The stitch looks best if you insert the needle in and bring the needle out from both pieces of fabric at the same distance from the edge of the fabric. We'll start by inserting the needle through the back piece only. So between the two pieces of fabric, insert the needle going from front to back. Bring the needle to the front of both pieces. Insert the needle into the front piece at about the same distance as your last stitch, then insert it into the same hole that you did when we started. Pull it through, but not all the way. Leave a small loop and insert your needle through that loop. Pull it taut. You don't want to pull it tight so that it's pulling on the fabric, and you don't want it too loose so that it's moving around. To make the first stitch, we're going to insert the needle front to back, going through the front and back pieces, making sure that the distance from the edge of the fabric is the same on both sides. Again, pull the thread through, leaving a small loop, and insert your needle through that loop. The texture of crochet thread is different from embroidery floss, so I had to monkey around with it a little bit more to get the stitches to lay the way I wanted them. We'll repeat this pattern all the way around the outside of the gingerbread, making sure to keep our stitches the same size and distance apart. And it only takes a little bit of adjusting to make the stitches even. You don't want to get too far along and then find out that you have to pull on the thread several stitches before and then have to adjust all of the stitches after. This stitch looks so beautiful when the stitches are even and the same size. It can take a little bit of practice if you're new to it just to get it right, but don't get discouraged. I won't take you all the way around the gingerbread, but I do want to show you how to start a new thread to make it look seamless. I'm coming to the end of my thread, so I'll want to finish my last stitch. You'll want to leave yourself more thread to work with than I did here. But now we're going to fasten off this thread and start a new one. And we don't want to have any gaps between our stitches. So after your last completed stitch, we're going to insert the needle around the thread from the last stitch that's between the two layers. Insert the needle underneath, pull it through, but not all the way. You want to leave yourself a tiny loop. We'll fasten the thread off with a single or double knot between the layers. You can see I just left a small loop about the width of a stitch. To start a new thread, we're going to start just like we did the last new thread, in between both layers, going through the back layer only from front to back. Make sure that the knots are in between both layers. Bring the needle to the front, going through both layers, coming out that same hole that we just made. Pull the thread through, but not all the way. Leave a small loop and insert the needle through the loop. I apologize, I didn't know that I was going out of frame, but I'm just making some adjustments to the stitch. Now we're going to pick up that loop that we left in the last stitch. Insert the needle back to front through that loop. Pull the thread and tighten it, and now it looks just like the other stitches, and no one would ever guess that you started a new thread. Continue with the blanket stitch around half of the body. I've stitched halfway around the gingerbread, and now I'm going to cut and place the rickrack onto the gingerbread. For this pillow, I did things out of order from what I would normally do because I was multitasking and not really paying attention, but I do recommend attaching the rickrack to areas where you've already stitched. For the eyes, I used some round wood pieces that I bought from Hobby Lobby. I painted them black, and I'm just going to add some details to the eyes. I do end up changing those lines that I added, and you'll see the finished eyes in a little bit. I'm going to add my buttons to the gingerbread. Jingle bells would also look really cute in place of the buttons. I tied some felt ribbon and a very easy bow, and I'll attach that to the neck. To keep the buttons in place while I sew them on, I'm just adding a little bit of glue. I'm right-handed, and unfortunately I wasn't paying attention and I sewed the right side of the gingerbread, which makes it really hard to get in there to sew the buttons and add the stuffing. So if you're left-handed, I recommend sewing the right side of the gingerbread first, leaving the left side open, and if you're right-handed like me, sew the left side of the gingerbread first, leaving the right side open for stuffing. Now what I should have done was sewn the buttons to the front panel before sewing them together. I sewed the buttons and the detail around them just like I did in the previous project. But because I'm using crochet thread instead of embroidery floss, I wrapped the thread around the needle only 2 times to make the French knots. You don't have to do French knots, but I really like the detail that it adds to the project. I attached the wood eyes to the gingerbread using Fabri-Tac glue. I do still have the lines on the eyes, but I will change that in a bit. Of course, I have to give this cute little guy some blush cheeks. This time I'm using some eyeshadow. I used polyfill to stuff my pillow. You'll just want to make sure that you're putting a nice even layer of the polyfill throughout the pillow, making sure to completely fill the little areas like the arms and legs. I'm reaching the end of my stitches, and it just happened to work out perfectly that they're all evenly spaced and I didn't have to make any adjustments on the last stitches. To finish off my last stitch, I'm just going to insert the needle into the very first stitch and pull it through, and that completes the last stitch. I'll make a double knot and hide it inside the gingerbread. I'll finish by making any adjustments like gluing the rickrack down in areas that it was loose, adding the last pieces of rickrack, and finishing the eyes. Here's a final look at the gingerbread pillow. I think he turned out cute as a button, pun intended. If you enjoyed this tutorial, please don't forget to give it a thumbs up. And if you're new to my channel, please hit that subscribe button.